All right. Well, thank you very much for coming, my dear friends. My name is Robert H. Blackman. I've been teaching here at Hampden-Sydney College since the fall of 2000, and I'm very pleased to be able to share with you over the miracle of the internet, over the marvel that is Zoom, a talk designed for a general audience, for our friends, our alumni, and our students who have a strong and abiding interest in history. And I wanted to thank Professor James Fusetta for conceiving of this series of talks about 75 years after the end of World War II, and for inviting me to give one of those talks, and for allowing me to speak about one of my favorite topics, that is France, modern France and its empire. So there's long been a story that the end of European empires following World War II was a rapid and thorough process caused by the weakness of Europe following the war and a hunger for self-government in the colonies. Though there were fits and starts and violent wars, the process allegedly unrolled quickly for the most part, with a watershed in the 60s, so that only Portugal maintained a substantial empire, and even that was gone by the 1970s. More recent research has shown that the process was more violent and less thorough than one might suppose. Decolonization was not the end of European colonialism, but a reconfiguration of the relationship between Europe and the rest of the world following the Second World War. Europe's former colonies could achieve political independence of a sort quickly, but could not easily disentangle themselves from the political, economic, and social forces that had marked the colonial era. Decolonization sprang from a variety of causes. As with European colonial history since 1600, the various powers had to take international politics and diplomacy into account. They also faced serious political opposition in the colonies themselves, and the cost of maintaining empire after World War II, economic, political, and military, had risen dramatically. Possession of colonies had been a major part of the great power contest in Europe before the First World War, with England and France both realizing that their colonial might allowed them to punch far above their demographic weight in European affairs. As the British politician Lord Curzon had said in 1901, "As long as we rule India, we are the greatest power in the world. If we lose it, we drop straight away to a third-rate power." French sentiments about their empire, especially their empire in North Africa, were the same. British colonial troops fought in large numbers in the First World War, and France too had deployed significant numbers of Senegalese and Algerian riflemen on the Western Front. The contributions made by colonial subjects in World War I encouraged local elites to hope for more political and economic independence after the war, even if inside the old empires. They were disappointed. If anything, the British and French became more convinced that colonies were the key to maintaining political relevance in the post-war world, and far from granting autonomy to their old colonies, they acquired more territory through the mandate system set up by the League of Nations, expanding their holdings in Africa and the Middle East substantially. It turned out that the First World War had been a piker compared to World War II. The imperial powers in Europe were exhausted by the Second World War. They were overshadowed by the two victors, the United States of America and the USSR. Both of these powers were avowedly anti-colonial. The Soviet Union had seldom interfered in European colonial affairs directly, though the Soviets did see the colonies as supporting the capitalist world order and wished, in the words of historian James Lenning, to, quote, make the world safe for revolution, unquote. While the USA did back its allies, France and Britain, in their efforts to hold on to important or strategic colonies after the war, the Americans saw the contradiction between their rhetoric and their actions, pushing Britain and France to make concessions to colonial independence movements and putting limits to the willingness of the US to fund wars to reconquer or retain the colonies. Nevertheless, the European powers understood that without their empires, they could not compete in great power affairs. Great Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Portugal all sought to maintain their empires after the war. None of them succeeded. Tonight, we will focus on the French Empire and its rapid collapse after World War II. I'll start by discussing why France had an empire in the first place, move on to how World War II impacted the empire, and then to the story of the French retreat from its empire, focusing on its failures to keep hold of Indochina, now the independent states of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and to maintain control of its most important colony, long seen as a part of metropolitan France itself, Algeria. Then I'll offer a few concluding remarks before answering questions. In order to discuss decolonization, we have to know something about how the French and why the French had an empire in the first place. By the 19th century, France had lost most of its first overseas empire, that included parts of North America, parts of India, and they only held a few islands in the Caribbean and off the coast of North America, Guyana in South America, and a series of trading cities in West Africa with some territory in the Indian Ocean. The second French overseas empire came into being between 1830 and 1914, as France conquered or forced into protectorate status Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, large parts of West and Equatorial Africa, Madagascar, Indochina, New Caledonia, and various islands in Oceania, marked in gold on this map, which, by the way, is by the Navy League in France, arguing that the French needed a very strong navy to protect and link together their empire. These territories had supported France in the First World War, supplying soldiers and workers, as well as providing important war materials. After World War I, France was granted mandates by the League of Nations over parts of the old German and Ottoman empires, expanding its territory in Africa and gaining control of Syria and Lebanon. By 1939, there were more than 60 million people in the empire, more than the 50 million in metropolitan France itself. Some parts of the empire were considered civilized enough to enjoy more rights than others. Algeria, for example, was declared part of France in much the same way as Hawaii or Alaska are part of the USA today. According to this poster, a propaganda poster from 1930s supporting empire in France, according to this poster, just under 80,000 Frenchmen employed in administering the empire brought peace and goodwill to 60 million people all around the world. France had a particular vision of itself as an imperial power. The key idea for understanding the French Empire is the civilizing mission. In 1870, France had become a republic and prided itself on its republican values, which the French saw as universal values, appropriate and desirable for all of the world's peoples. Much as they had during the French Revolution and under Napoleon, the French arrived and conquered territories bearing the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. They intended to tear down the old regimes in areas they administered and replace them with a secular state, the rule of law, and commercial capitalism. They intended to educate the natives, raise them up to the level of their European brothers, and bring them fully into the brotherhood of mankind. Colonial natives could go to French schools, improve themselves, assimilate to French culture, and achieve full French citizenship. All they had to do was give up their native culture, their native language, and any native religion. All they had to do was change local economic practices and completely retool their economy to serve the needs of France. Not surprisingly, few colonial natives were up for this bargain. In practice, the empire was ruled according to two very different sets of laws. One set was for the French and for fully assimilated natives. The other was for natives who had not, according to the French at least, reached a sufficient stage of civilization to appreciate their rights. This second set of people in the colonies, the vast majority, was denied political representation, was subject to coerced labor, faced land expropriation, and was subject to conscription in the colonial military. In effect, France itself was a republic, but the people of its colonies were subjects, not citizens. As you can imagine, from the very beginning of the empire, there was resistance to French domination. This resistance increased over time as more imperial subjects became educated and understood the liberatory, revolutionary potential of France's history and culture, and wanted to understand the rights, freedom, and dignity the French claimed to protect and provide with their empire. Now, one of my favorite places to visit in Paris had its origins in the French Empire. At the eastern edge of the city is this building, the Palais de la Porte Dorée. And the Porte Dorée means the golden or gilded gate. In the basement of this building is a tropical aquarium. I've gone to that aquarium many times with my son, who, when he was younger, loved looking at all the fish and all the sea life. And this sea life is from all over the world. It's from saltwater oceans, freshwater. It's from South America, from Africa, and from the Pacific. You can see electric eels, you can see lungfish, you can see jellyfish. It turns out that these fish had originally been carefully curated as part of an exhibition showing the reach of the French Empire, the Colonial Exposition of 1931. Each sea creature was meant to showcase a different part of the world where the tricolor flag flew. You see, this is the fresco found on the poster for this event. This fresco is up one floor from the aquarium on the entry floor for the building. And the building originally held exhibits of arts and crafts from all over the empire. The figure in the center of this fresco represents France, and she is surrounded by allegorical representations of the 5 continents to which the French had allegedly brought civilization. The point of the International Colonial Exposition of 1931 had been to show France's strength and power, its sophistication, and its dedication to civilizing the people of its empire, bringing them up to what they saw as the proper cultural, intellectual, and political standards, the standards of the French Republic. The French fancied themselves as the very model of a modern nation state in the 1930s. And in their rhetoric, they leaned heavily on the Republican traditions established in the French Revolution. At the exposition, you could visit any corner of the empire. And when you went to those corners, you found people who'd been brought in to display themselves as human exhibits. A shocking way to treat people, as if they were fish or animals, which were also carted in from around the globe for display. The origins of that aquarium I enjoy so much. At the expo brought metropolitan French citizens into contact with the empire without any stress or inconvenience. The French could see the good work they were doing around the globe. Pith helmets were on sale for the day trip adventurer to make them feel more part of the action. The wonders of the world were recreated in Paris. You could see the splendor and historical importance of France's territories. The French showed a great appreciation for the history and the art and the culture of the territories they held, and claimed that they alone could preserve this great heritage for posterity. Now, they were not alone in displaying their imperial might. They invited other colonial powers. The Dutch, the British, the Belgians all showed off the extent and richness of their colonial holdings. The United States, getting ready for the bicentennial of George Washington's birth, chose instead to recreate Mount Vernon there, as you see in this slide. Now, in the 1930s, France's empire was very important to them. The empire was an important part of the metropolitan French's self-image. All of the political parties, even the Communist Party to a great extent, favored maintaining the empire. Though the French population grew during the 1920s and 1930s, it grew more slowly than the German population. France saw itself in a relative demographic decline. And they saw their empire as a way to keep up with Germany in terms of population and economic might. And voters agreed. The empire was popular with the French. It was not as popular in the empire. There was considerable unrest throughout the empire in the period between the First and Second World Wars. The empire had made tremendous sacrifices during the First World War, sending hundreds of thousands of soldiers, hundreds of thousands of workers to France, and providing vital materials for the war. Local elites had expected reforms that would allow them a greater role in governing in the colonies, even though the colonies would remain within the empire. But reforms were few and far between, not least because French settlers in the colonies strongly resisted reform, especially in Algeria. In 1936, the Popular Front government tried to implement citizenship and voting reforms, but had very little success getting them implemented. And by 1939, the French understood that they were going to need the empire's support in order to fight a new war. They had needed the empire's support and more to defeat Germany in World War I. All reforms within the empire ground to a halt, as modest as they were. France recruited soldiers again from its empire and mobilized for another total war. French defeat in 1940 threw the empire into confusion. France itself became divided between a zone occupied by Nazi Germany and an area under the authority of the Vichy state, which embarked on a reactionary national revolution meant to purge France of its republican traditions. The majority of the colonies remained loyal to Vichy, when a little general, Charles de Gaulle, declared from London that the war was not lost and that it would be fought to completion and victory from a base in the empire. De Gaulle's first task was to get the empire to agree to fight. The vast majority of French soldiers who served after the initial defeat in 1940 came from the empire. The French Army of Africa made up the bulk of forces under Charles de Gaulle's command in 1940, and he had access to them only because the governor of Chad had chosen to follow de Gaulle. Forces loyal to de Gaulle took over French Equatorial Africa first, then French West Africa, before joining with British and US forces for Operation Torch in 1942. Victory in Morocco and Algeria gave the Free French access to more colonial troops, and in 1943, the Free French forces and the Army of Africa were amalgamated into the French Expeditionary Corps. The road to Paris and victory in Europe, it turned out, ran through the empire and the army consisted mainly of imperial subjects. The colonial contribution in World War II was even larger than it had been in World War I. Not surprisingly, local elites expected victory to bring concessions, to lead to better treatment, to bring more opportunity for colonial subjects. They demanded, quite rightly, that they cease to be ruled as subjects and instead be treated on an equal footing with the other citizens of France. After the war, however, the French sought a means to maintain their empire. The French Constitution of 1946 allowed for some greater autonomy for colonies within what was then called the French Union. But the framework envisioned never worked very well, as it was meant to maintain clear French dominance while allowing for some greater local participation, rather than allowing for any real autonomy to the colonies. Decolonization in Africa began on the same day that victory in Europe was declared. In the Algerian city of Sétif, massive crowds came together to celebrate the French victory on the 8th of May, 1945, won in part by Algerian soldiers. During the celebration, Algerian nationalists waved flags indicating their support for greater autonomy or even independence from France. Police seized the flags and fighting broke out. The rebellion continued through the month and ended when European settlers and police attacked the natives, killing between 6,000 and 45,000 men. The sources vary widely in their estimates. 6,000 and 45,000 men, women, and children. Nationalist politicians were forced to go underground. Instead of engaging in reforms meant to expand opportunity for the natives of Algeria, the French found themselves trying to balance the demands of 1 million settlers of European descent and 8 million natives of Algeria, all of whom had made great sacrifices during the war, but who had very different ideas about what the future should hold. The settlers were overwhelmingly against any reforms that would increase the political power of native Algerians. And the settlers had the ear of French politicians. Things were no better in colonial Indochina. In 1940, the Japanese had invaded Indochina and in 1941 fully took over the colony. However, they did not remove the French colonial government, instead using it to rule the colony for the benefit of Imperial Japan. Resistance to Japanese occupation came from Vietnamese nationalists, many of whom had been involved in political unrest during the 1930s as they agitated for greater autonomy within the French Empire. The French administration cooperated with the Japanese in fighting against the rebels, while the United States and China supported the nationalists, led by Ho Chi Minh and Nguyen Giap. These two men were communists, but they led a broad coalition of nationalists called the Viet Minh. It was these nationalists who fought against the Japanese in Indochina. In March of 1945, the Japanese overthrew the French colonial government and declared Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos separate and independent states, albeit under Japanese tutelage. In September of 1945, following the surrender of Japan and the end of the war, with Vietnam occupied in the north by Chinese troops and the south by British troops, Ho Chi Minh declared independence for Vietnam. British troops, supported by Japanese soldiers still in Vietnam, helped the French reestablish control of the south, and the Viet Minh were driven out of Saigon. But Hanoi in the north remained under Viet Minh control. By 1946, attempts at a compromise meant to keep Vietnam in a French Commonwealth failed and war broke out. Ho Chi Minh and his nationalist allies were able to keep control of the northern parts of Vietnam. The French were mostly able to maintain control in the rest. In 1949, the French attempted to draw nationalist support away from the Viet Minh, non-communist national support, by declaring Vietnam to be a unified state under the control of its former emperor, though still within the French Union. This attempt to strip away support from the Viet Minh failed, and by 1950, it became increasingly clear that France could not win quickly in Vietnam, if at all. How the French fought in Vietnam was important as well. As the colony was far away and the people of France preoccupied with economic recovery from World War II, there was no political will to send French soldiers all the way around the world to fight. Most of the soldiers who fought there were colonial soldiers, drawn from Indochina itself, but also drawn from Africa, from Senegal, from Morocco, from Algeria, and from Tunisia, with support from the French Foreign Legion. The costs of the war were beyond the means of the French government and were borne largely by the United States. The United States made it clear, especially after China became communist in 1949, that they would support French efforts to keep the colony under European control rather than see it an independent state in the communist orbit. In the end, the French kept fighting in Vietnam not so much because they valued Vietnam, as because they thought that a failure in Vietnam would threaten the rest of their empire. By 1954, it was clear that the French could not defeat Ho Chi Minh and his allies. The French stepped aside, and the United States took over efforts to keep Vietnam out of the communist camp. The French Empire had begun to crumble. And French failures in Vietnam emboldened nationalists in Algeria. Just as the French left Vietnam, a rebellion erupted in Algeria. On the 1st of November, 1954, a coalition of nationalist groups, calling themselves the National Liberation Front, or the FLN, declared a war of liberation against French control and began attacks on French police, military, and civilian targets. In August of 1955, FLN commandos attacked Europeans in the coastal city of Philippeville, with 71 Europeans and 52 Muslims killed in pitched fighting. In remote parts of the country, European settlers were attacked and killed. The French responded to these attacks with atrocities. They were simply unwilling to allow Algeria, the centerpiece of their empire, to become independent. European civilians and the French army killed perhaps 10,000 native Algerians, with the military simply shelling the native parts of some cities. The French set up special military units to pacify the countryside and did away with local political institutions. They recruited natives for a special militia meant to assist the army in maintaining order. In all, more than 180,000 native Muslims joined this militia, far more men than the FLN was able to muster. By 1956, it seemed that the French had the upper hand. The leaders of the FLN had been captured and fighting had largely died out, but it was a false dawn. In September of 1956, the Battle of Algiers began when the FLN sent women into the European sector of the Algerian capital to set bombs meant to target and kill civilians. For the next year, terrorist bombings and shootings were a daily occurrence. The French again responded to provocation with atrocities. If the French government had been reluctant to send metropolitan troops all the way to Vietnam, they had no qualms about sending young draftees to fight in Algeria. Elite troops under General Jacques Mousseau were sent into Algiers, and he was told to use whatever means were necessary to restore order. He deemed torture and massacre necessary. The FLN responded with similar measures. The war in Algeria became an escalating war of atrocities. The sheer brutality of the French response, both military and civilian, spread resistance to French rule. In 1958, a new cabinet formed in Paris under a centrist prime minister who indicated a willingness to negotiate with the FLN. On hearing this, European settlers in Algeria turned out in huge numbers, demanding that this new cabinet be rejected by the National Assembly, and the demonstrations turned into widespread anti-Muslim rioting. General Mousseau responded to the breakdown in order and the demands of the Algerian European settlers by using the French army in Algeria to seize power, demanding that a new government be formed in Paris under Charles de Gaulle. By the end of May 1958, the National Assembly in Paris had voted to give de Gaulle extraordinary powers to write a new constitution for France. The colonial tail had decisively wagged the imperial dog. And it's worth remembering just how entangled France was with its empire at this time. General Mousseau is a good example of the way in which the empire had been central to the career of army officers. He had joined the French army in 1928 as an officer, and his first assignment was in Morocco, leading French colonial troops from Senegal, putting down an uprising in Morocco. He was in Chad, leading colonial troops when World War II began, and he joined the Free French. He led troops in Africa, he led troops to Normandy, and he led troops that invaded Paris. After World War II, he led troops in Indochina. He was instrumental in the invasion of Suez in 1956, before becoming the lead general in Algeria. And in 1958, he led a coup in Algeria, threatened an invasion of France unless de Gaulle was returned to power. De Gaulle came to Algeria in June of 1958 and said to cheering crowds that he had understood the settlers. But he also, privately, had no interest in military rule. After taking power as legally as possible as a civilian president, he spent the next 4 years trying to extricate France from the mess in Algeria. To prevent unrest in other parts of the empire, while he sought an exit from Algeria, de Gaulle changed the name of the French Union to the French Community in the Constitution of 1958, offering to alter the terms by which the colonies related to the metropole. He held referenda in each colony, though not initially in Algeria, asking if the colonials would rather remain colonies, would rather have autonomy within the community, or have full independence. Though almost all of the colonies initially chose autonomy within the French community, by 1960, most of the colonies had become independent. In 1959, with the other colonies mostly being sorted out, de Gaulle began trying to find moderates in Algeria with whom a deal could be made that would outflank both the FLN and the European settlers. the settlers responded to his efforts by trying to have him assassinated. And in January of 1960, a group of settler extremists seized control of Algiers. French troops in Algeria refused to stop them. De Gaulle made sure the army in France supported him, then appealed over the heads of the pro-settler officers in Algeria to the troops themselves. He had the army behind him, and without army support, the insurrection failed. De Gaulle knew that it was time to get out of Algeria before the crisis there became a general crisis for all of France. In January of 1961, de Gaulle held a referendum on the right of Algerians to determine their own fate. Every French citizen in the empire was allowed to vote, and 75% voted in favor of Algerians deciding their own fate. Then, in July of 1962, the Algerians themselves were allowed to vote and voted overwhelmingly for independence. The Second French Overseas Empire was at an end. The referenda and the Algerian independence did not stop violence, however. Before Algerians voted for their independence, from March to May of 1962, opponents of Algerian independence had terrorized France and Algeria with bombings and assassinations. Violence continued into the summer. After independence, retaliatory violence led close to 1 million European settlers and some 90,000 native Algerians to flee across the Mediterranean to France. This million people, many of them deeply disenchanted with France and the French government, joined other men and women from the former colonies who came to France seeking work, education, and safety. Which brings us back to the Palais de la Porte Dorée. It was originally meant to be a permanent museum displaying the greatness and the riches of the French colonial empire. By the 1960s, with the disappearance of the empire, it had become a museum for African and oceanic art. The museum was again refurbished and reopened as the Museum of the History of Immigration in 2000 to tell the story of the many people from around the world, though mainly from the French colonies, who came to France after the 1960s and before in order to find new lives. But the story of immigration into France is a different story for another time. I wanted to thank you for coming to this talk, and I wanted to thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak with you. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to connect with our alumni and to have some contact outside of the classroom with our students. I hope you've enjoyed what I had to say, and I look forward to answering your questions. I also wanted to mention that Hampden-Sydney's Giving Day is coming up next month, and I wanted to encourage you to join me in donating a little money to the history department and to Hampden-Sydney as you and as we all are able. And finally, just a look at some sources that I used and things that you might want to read